They found her dying in the creek, just a broken child with war paint still fresh on her face. But 20 years later, she returned leading an alliance that would shake the very foundations of the Old West. If stories like this grip your soul, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because the tales we're about to uncover will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about courage, loyalty, and the price of doing what's right. In the summer of 1854, the Texas frontier was a place where mercy was scarce and trust could get you killed. The Comanche Wars had turned neighbor against neighbor, leaving scars deeper than any canyon. It was in this unforgiving landscape that Sam Wheeler ran his cattle ranch, a weathered man with calloused hands and a heart that hadn't yet turned to stone. The dusty barn where Sam stored his winter feed would become the stage for an act that defied every rule of survival on the frontier. When most folks saw Comanche, they saw death riding toward their doorstep. But Sam Wheeler was about to discover that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is show compassion to those the world has deemed your enemy. On a morning when the Texas heat shimmered like liquid fire across the plains, Sam would find a child whose broken body would test every belief he held about right and wrong. Little did he know that this single moment of humanity would echo across 2 decades, returning to him in a form more powerful than any force the Old West had ever witnessed. The girl's name was Ayanna, which meant eternal blossom in her native tongue, though when Sam first laid eyes on her, death seemed far more likely than any kind of blooming. What happened next would prove that in the harsh world of cowboys and conflicts, sometimes the smallest seeds of kindness grow into the mightiest oak trees. Sam was mending fence near Willow Creek when he heard it, a sound that made his blood run cold. Not quite human, not quite animal, but something caught between life and its final surrender. Following the creek's bend, he discovered her, a Comanche girl, maybe 8 years old, unconscious and bleeding from wounds that spoke of cavalry sabers and settler vengeance. Her traditional dress was torn and stained with dried blood, but what struck Sam most was the careful way someone had painted her face before she'd been hurt. This wasn't a war party. This was a child who'd been dressed for ceremony, probably a naming ritual or seasonal celebration. The thought of what had interrupted such an occasion made Sam's jaw clench with an anger he didn't expect to feel. Every instinct screamed at him to walk away. Helping a Comanche, even a dying child, could bring the wrath of both worlds down on his head. The U.S. Army would brand him a sympathizer. The Comanche would see him as another white devil who'd stolen their child. But as Sam knelt beside Ayanna's broken form, watching her chest rise and fall in shallow gasps, he made a choice that would define the next 20 years of his life. He lifted her carefully, surprised by how light she felt in his arms. Her fever was burning through her small body like prairie fire, and Sam knew that within hours, she'd either be on the path to recovery or joining her ancestors in the spirit world. As he carried her toward his ranch house, one thought echoed in his mind, "Lord help us both." But what Sam didn't know was that miles away, Comanche warriors were already searching for their missing child, and this rescue would set in motion events that would reshape the entire region forever. For 3 days and nights, Sam fought death for Ayanna's soul. He'd never tended wounds like these before, deep gashes that spoke of systematic cruelty rather than the clean violence of warfare. Someone had hurt this child deliberately, methodically, and the thought filled Sam with a rage that surprised him with its intensity. His ranch hand, old Miguel, had disappeared the moment he saw Sam carrying the Comanche girl. "Trouble follows that one like vultures follow carrion," Miguel had muttered before riding into town, leaving Sam alone with his dangerous choice. The isolation felt complete. No help from civilization, no guidance from anyone who might understand the gravity of what he was attempting. Ayanna drifted in and out of consciousness, speaking in fevered whispers that Sam couldn't understand. But during her lucid moments, her dark eyes would fix on his face with an intensity that seemed to pierce straight through to his soul. There was intelligence there, and a kind of ancient wisdom that seemed impossible in someone so young. Sam found himself talking to her as he changed her bandages, sharing stories about his late wife Sarah, about the cattle that refused to stay where they belonged, about the loneliness that had settled over his ranch like dust after a drought. He didn't know if she understood English, but something in her expression suggested she was listening to more than just his words. On the fourth morning, Ayana sat up and spoke her first clear sentence in broken English. "Why you save enemy child?" The question hit Sam like a physical blow, because he realized he didn't have a good answer, at least not one that made sense in the brutal logic of frontier survival. But as he looked into those intelligent dark eyes, Sam understood that this moment would define everything that followed. His answer would echo across decades, shaping not just Ayana's future, but the destiny of everyone their lives would touch. What began as simple mercy evolved into something far more complex over the following weeks. Ayana proved to be a quick learner, absorbing English phrases with startling speed and showing Sam traditional Comanche methods for healing that put his rough frontier medicine to shame. She taught him which plants could stop bleeding, which roots could break a fever, and how to read the sky for weather changes days in advance. In return, Sam shared the skills of ranch life, how to gentle a spooked horse with patience instead of force, how to read cattle behavior, and how to fix things that seemed beyond repair. But more importantly, he showed her something she'd never experienced from a white person: respect for her knowledge and culture, even as he helped her navigate his world. The arrangement couldn't last forever, and they both knew it. Every sunset brought them closer to the day when Ayana would have to choose between worlds, return to her people or try to make a life in Sam's civilization. Neither option seemed safe, and both carried the weight of permanent separation from everything she'd known before that terrible day by the creek. During long evenings on the porch, Ayana would tell Sam stories of her people, not the savage tales he'd heard in town, but accounts of families, laughter, traditions that stretched back through generations like an unbroken chain. Sam began to understand that he'd saved more than just a child. He'd rescued a living library of knowledge and culture. But their peaceful bubble was about to burst. Late one night, Sam heard horses approaching his ranch, not the casual gait of neighbors, but the careful, purposeful movement of riders who preferred darkness to daylight. As he reached for his rifle, Ayana placed a small hand on his arm and whispered, "My people come. Now we see if your kindness was wise or foolish." The moment of reckoning had arrived, and Sam realized that everything he'd done over the past month would be judged in the next few minutes. But what happened when those Comanche warriors dismounted would surprise everyone involved. The Comanche war party that rode into Sam's yard wasn't what he'd expected. Instead of painted faces and raised weapons, he saw exhausted men who'd been searching for weeks, led by a warrior whose grief had carved deep lines around his eyes. When Ayana stepped out from behind Sam, the warrior's composure cracked like ice in spring thaw. "My daughter," the man whispered in broken English, dropping from his horse with a grace that spoke of decades in the saddle. Sam realized he was looking at Ayana's father, Chief Running Bear, a name even white settlers spoke with grudging respect. The reunion between father and daughter was wordless, profound, and more moving than any speech about frontier justice Sam had ever heard. What followed challenged every assumption Sam held about Comanche culture. Instead of immediate hostility, Chief Running Bear approached him with the careful diplomacy of someone who understood that this white rancher had saved something more precious than gold. Through Ayana's translation, a conversation began that would reshape both men's understanding of honor, debt, and what it meant to be human in an inhuman time. Chief Running Bear examined his daughter carefully, noting not just her healed wounds but the new knowledge in her eyes. She'd learned to navigate between worlds, and that skill would make her invaluable to her people in the difficult years ahead. But the chief also recognized that Sam Wheeler had given Ayana something beyond medical care. He'd given her respect, dignity, and proof that enemies could sometimes become family. Before leaving, Chief Running Bear performed a ceremony that Sam didn't understand but felt in his bones, something about debts that transcended death, about bonds that would outlast the stars themselves. Ayana translated only part of it. "He says you are now family. That means something different to us than it does to you. Family protects family, no matter how many years pass." As the Comanche party rode into the darkness, Ayana turned back once to wave at Sam. Neither of them knew it would be 20 years before they saw each other again, or that when that day came, she would return as something far more powerful than the broken child he'd saved. 20 years passed like seasons in a drought, slowly, harshly, leaving marks on everything they touched. Sam Wheeler aged into a man whose solitude had become both armor and prison, whose ranch prospered even as his heart remained locked away. He never married again, never spoke of the Comanche child he'd once saved, but neighbors noticed he was the one rancher who never lost cattle to Indian raids. The frontier changed around him with brutal efficiency. The army pushed the Comanche further west, treaty by broken treaty. Towns sprouted like weeds after rain, bringing with them the kind of men who saw profit in other people's misery. Sam watched it all with growing unease, sensing that the careful balance he'd helped create was crumbling under the weight of expanding civilization. Meanwhile, in the hidden canyons and secret places where her people had retreated, Ayanna grew into something unprecedented, a bridge between worlds who spoke 5 languages fluently and understood the politics of survival better than generals twice her age. She'd become not just a warrior, but a diplomat who could negotiate with white officials in the morning and plan traditional ceremonies in the evening. The child Sam had saved had evolved into Chief Ayanna, leader of the largest intertribal alliance the region had ever seen. Comanche, Apache, Kiowa, and even some Cherokee had united under her leadership, not for war, but for survival in a world that seemed determined to erase them from existence. Her reputation spread in whispers through both cultures. To whites, she was the ghost chief who could vanish armies into thin air. To native peoples, she was the bridge to a future where their children might live without constant fear. But Ayanna never forgot the white rancher who'd shown her that kindness could exist between enemies. She'd sensed subtle signs over the years, cattle that wandered back to Sam's ranch when rustlers tried to steal them, water sources that never dried up during the worst droughts, and a strange protection that seemed to hover over his property like an invisible shield. Sam felt that protection without understanding its source, never suspecting that the broken child he'd once nursed back to health had grown into the most powerful native leader in Texas, and that she was about to repay her debt in ways that would shock the entire frontier. The trouble arrived in Millbrook County wearing expensive suits and carrying legal documents that might as well have been weapons. Cornelius Blackwood and his Texas Land Development Company had one goal: acquire every acre of prime ranch land between the Brazos and Colorado rivers, by purchase if possible, by force if necessary. Sam Wheeler's spread sat right in the middle of their target zone. Blackwood was everything Sam despised about the New West, a man who'd never spent a day in the saddle but somehow controlled more land than most small territories. His methods were refined versions of the same brutality that had always plagued the frontier: legal manipulation, economic pressure, and when those failed, the kind of accidents that befell people who refused to sell at reasonable prices. The first warning came in the form of Sam's cattle turning up dead, apparently from a disease that affected only his herd while leaving neighboring livestock untouched. Then his water wells began to show signs of contamination that made no scientific sense. When Sam tried to hire help to investigate, he discovered that every available ranch hand in 3 counties had suddenly found more lucrative employment with Blackwood's operation. The campaign was so systematic, so thorough, that Sam realized he was facing something far more dangerous than ordinary land grabbers. Blackwood had unlimited resources, political connections that reached all the way to Austin, and absolutely no scruples about destroying anyone who stood between him and profit. The old rules of frontier justice meant nothing to a man who fought with paperwork and politicians instead of guns and horses. As Sam sat on his porch one evening, watching vultures circle his latest dead cattle, he felt more isolated than he had since Sarah's death. At 63, he was too old to start over somewhere else, too proud to surrender without a fight, but too realistic to believe he could win against such overwhelming odds. But what Sam didn't know was that hundreds of miles away, in a hidden canyon where smoke signals carried news faster than telegraph wires, Chief Ayanna was receiving reports about the white rancher who'd saved her life and the forces that were now threatening to destroy everything he'd built. The morning Sam Wheeler found fresh horse tracks around his property, he knew his time was running out. These weren't the shod prints of Blackwood's hired guns, these were unshod tracks, made by horses that moved like ghosts across the landscape. For the first time in 20 years, Comanche had returned to his ranch, and Sam's blood ran cold with the implications. What he discovered at sunrise defied every assumption he'd made about his situation. Instead of a war party, he found a single figure waiting by his corral, a woman whose bearing spoke of absolute authority, whose traditional dress was adorned with silver that caught the early light like captured stars. When she turned to face him, Sam's world tilted on its axis. "Hello, Sam Wheeler," Ayanna said in English that carried no trace of accent. "I believe we have much to discuss." 20 years had transformed the broken child into something magnificent, a leader whose presence seemed to command respect from the very air around her. But her eyes, those intelligent dark eyes that had once looked at him with fevered gratitude, remained exactly the same. The reunion was wordless at first, two people who'd shared something profound recognizing how much time and tragedy had changed them both. Sam saw in Ayanna's face the weight of leadership, the scars of battles fought with words instead of weapons, and the kind of wisdom that came from walking between worlds that wanted to destroy each other. "You're in trouble," Ayanna said simply, gesturing toward the dead cattle that dotted Sam's pasture. "Cornelius Blackwood thinks he can take your land because you have no allies, no power, no way to fight men who use law books instead of guns." Her slight smile carried dangerous implications. "He's made one critical error in his calculations." Sam felt his heart hammering as he realized what she was suggesting. "Ayanna, you can't risk your people for one old rancher. The world's changed too much. If they discover you're helping me—" But she raised a hand that silenced him more effectively than any shout. The child he'd saved was gone, replaced by someone who'd learned to make impossible things possible. What Ayanna proposed challenged everything Sam thought he knew about modern warfare. She hadn't come to fight Blackwood with rifles and war cries, she'd come to destroy him with something far more devastating: the truth, delivered with the precision of a master strategist who'd spent 2 decades learning how power really worked in the changing West. "Blackwood's strength comes from the shadows," Ayanna explained as they sat in Sam's kitchen, maps and documents spread between them like battle plans. "He bribes officials, forges documents, uses violence while maintaining plausible deniability. But every shadow has a light that can expose it." She'd brought evidence that made Sam's hands shake, detailed records of Blackwood's crimes, testimony from families he'd destroyed, proof of corruption that reached into the highest levels of state government. The network Ayanna had built was more sophisticated than any intelligence operation the U.S. Army had ever managed. Native scouts who could move unseen through any terrain, mixed blood traders who worked in white settlements, and allies in unexpected places who'd grown disgusted with Blackwood's methods. She'd turned the very invisibility that white society imposed on her people into an intelligence advantage that made them nearly omniscient. But the plan required something that terrified Sam more than any physical danger. He would have to trust completely in methods he didn't understand, guided by people whose ways of thinking were utterly foreign to his experience. Ayanna was asking him to step into her world as completely as she'd once stepped into his, and the stakes were higher than one ranch or one man's pride. "Your government believes in paperwork and procedure," Ayanna said, her eyes reflecting 20 years of hard-won knowledge. "Tomorrow, Blackwood arrives with Sheriff Morrison and forged documents to seize your property. But he doesn't know that we've been watching, learning, preparing for this moment since the first cow died mysteriously on your land." As night fell over the ranch, Sam watched riders materialize from the darkness like smoke given form. Not a war party, but something more dangerous, an alliance of tribes that had learned to fight the modern world with the modern world's own weapons. The child he'd saved had returned with an army unlike any the frontier had ever seen. Dawn broke over Sam's ranch to reveal a scene that belonged more to legend than reality. Blackwood arrived with Sheriff Morrison, a platoon of hired guns, and legal documents that should have made his victory inevitable. Instead, he found himself facing something that challenged every assumption about power in the modern West. Ayanna had positioned her alliance with strategic brilliance that would have impressed any cavalry commander. Native warriors hidden in positions that made the ranch house seem empty while actually creating an impenetrable defensive network. But more importantly, she'd brought witnesses, territorial judges, federal marshals, and newspaper reporters whose presence turned what should have been a quiet land grab into a very public reckoning. "Sheriff Morrison," Ayanna said, stepping into view with documents of her own, "I believe you'll find that Mr. Blackwood's paperwork contains several irregularities." Her English was perfect, her bearing regal, and her evidence devastating. What followed was a courtroom drama played out under the Texas sun, with the very future of the frontier hanging in the balance. Blackwood's confidence cracked like dried mud as his forged documents were exposed with surgical precision. Every bribed official, every falsified record, every family he'd destroyed, all of it laid bare by an intelligence network he'd never suspected existed. The hired guns he'd brought found themselves surrounded by warriors who'd materialized from landscape that had seemed empty moments before. But the real power of Ayanna's strategy became clear when federal authorities began arresting Blackwood's associates. This wasn't just about saving Sam's ranch, it was about dismantling an entire criminal organization that had been poisoning the frontier for years. The child Sam had saved had grown into someone who fought injustice with the patience and thoroughness of someone who understood that real victory meant permanent change. As Blackwood was led away in chains, his empire crumbling around him, Sam realized he'd witnessed something unprecedented, a battle won not with violence, but with justice applied with surgical precision. But the day's revelations weren't finished yet. As the dust settled from Blackwood's arrest, Ayanna revealed the full scope of what she'd accomplished, and why Sam's ranch had been worth such an enormous effort. The land grab hadn't been random. Blackwood had been working with railroad interests and federal authorities to create a corridor for westward expansion that would have displaced thousands of native families from their hidden refuges. Your ranch was the keystone, Ayanna explained, showing Sam survey maps that revealed the true stakes. Control your property, and they could justify military occupation of the entire river valley. My people would have been driven into badlands where nothing grows, nothing lives. The child he'd saved had become the guardian of countless families, and Sam's kindness 20 years ago had inadvertently created the alliance that saved them all. But Ayanna's revelations went deeper than strategic importance. Over the past 2 decades, she'd been quietly placing her people in positions throughout white society, as translators, scouts, traders, even as clerks in government offices. The vanished tribes hadn't disappeared, they'd gone underground, creating a shadow network that monitored and occasionally influenced events across the entire frontier. Sam Wheeler's ranch had unknowingly served as a neutral meeting ground where this network could operate. His reputation for fairness, earned through his treatment of one wounded child, had made him a trusted figure among native peoples he'd never even met. Without realizing it, he'd become the anchor point for the most sophisticated resistance movement in American history. You saved more than one child that day by the creek, Ayanna said quietly. You saved the future of my people. But more than that, you proved that your people and mine don't have to be eternal enemies. That lesson has shaped everything I've built since then. As Sam absorbed the magnitude of what had been happening around him for 20 years, he understood that this story was far from over. Blackwood's defeat was just the beginning of something larger, a new chapter in the relationship between two worlds that had been locked in conflict for generations. The true test came 3 months later, when federal authorities arrived to investigate the Comanche conspiracy that had destroyed Blackwood's empire. General Harrison Custer, nephew of the famous George Armstrong Custer, had come to Texas with orders to pacify the region once and for all. He'd brought 2 regiments of cavalry and instructions to make an example that would end native resistance permanently. What Custer found challenged every assumption he'd made about primitive warfare. Ayanna's alliance didn't hide in canyons waiting to be hunted down. They operated openly, legally, using the very systems white society had created to protect themselves. Every move Custer made was countered by lawyers, journalists, and political pressure that seemed to materialize from nowhere. The confrontation that would define the future took place not on a battlefield, but in the territorial courthouse in Austin. Ayanna, now revealed as the architect of the largest intertribal alliance in American history, faced down federal authorities in a legal battle that drew attention from Washington, D.C. to California. Sam Wheeler found himself thrust into the role of key witness, his testimony about that day 20 years ago becoming the foundation for Ayanna's argument. This woman, Sam told the packed courtroom, his voice carrying across a silence so complete it seemed sacred, was 8 years old and dying when I found her. I saved her life because it was the right thing to do, not because I was picking sides in some war. If showing mercy to a dying child makes me a criminal, then maybe it's the law that's wrong, not the kindness. The trial became a sensation that changed how Americans thought about the frontier. Ayanna's testimony, delivered in flawless English with evidence that exposed decades of government corruption and corporate greed, revealed a level of sophistication that shattered stereotypes about savage peoples. When she finished speaking, even General Custer was forced to acknowledge that traditional military solutions would never work against such an opponent. The verdict, when it came, surprised everyone involved. Rather than punishment, Ayanna was offered something unprecedented: official recognition of her alliance as a sovereign negotiating entity, with Sam Wheeler's ranch designated as neutral territory where treaties could be negotiated between equals rather than dictated by the stronger to the weaker. The Wheeler Ranch Treaty, signed in Sam's kitchen where he'd once nursed a dying child back to health, became the model for a new kind of relationship between native and white societies. Not the complete integration that would destroy tribal identity, nor the total separation that would doom both cultures to eternal conflict, but something entirely new: parallel societies that could cooperate without losing their essential natures. Ayanna established the ranch as headquarters for what became known as the Indigenous Council, a confederation of tribes that worked within American legal systems while maintaining their traditional governance structures. Sam found his property transformed into a place where two worlds met as equals, where children of both cultures learned each other's languages and customs. The changes rippled outward like stones thrown into still water. Other territories began adopting similar treaties. The railroad interests that had backed Blackwood found their expansion plans modified to account for native land rights. A generation of children grew up seeing cooperation as normal rather than exceptional, changing the entire trajectory of American westward expansion. 20 years after saving a dying child, Sam Wheeler discovered that his single act of compassion had grown into something that would outlast empires. On quiet evenings, as he watched Comanche and white children playing together in his yard while their parents discussed everything from cattle breeding to water rights, he understood that some debts create bonds stronger than blood, some kindnesses echo across generations, and some choices change the world in ways we never expect to see. The Old West had always been a place where individual choices mattered more than grand strategies. Sam Wheeler proved that sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is show mercy to someone who has every reason to be their enemy. In a land built on conflict, he chose compassion, and that choice became the seed of peace.